Her name is Nancy Guthrie, and depending on who you ask, she is either a beloved figure of extraordinary faith and resilience, or the center of one of the most emotionally explosive mysteries hiding in plain sight. For years, Nancy lived her life in front of audiences. She stood on stages. She wrote books. She counseled grieving families. She looked people in the eye and told them that pain has a purpose. But behind those words, behind that composed, steady voice, was a private life full of losses so staggering, so relentless, that even her most devoted followers found themselves quietly asking, how does someone survive this much heartbreak? And now new evidence has surfaced. Details that don't quite line up. Questions that haven't been answered. A timeline that makes careful observers stop and rewind. What is the real story behind Nancy Guthrie? What has she never fully said out loud? And why does the latest information change everything we thought we knew? Stay with us, because this story is about to go somewhere you did not expect. To understand the mystery, you first have to understand the woman. Nancy Guthrie is not a celebrity in the traditional Hollywood sense. She doesn't walk red carpets. She doesn't trend on social media for feuds or fashion. She moves in quieter circles, circles of faith, grief, theology, and human suffering. And yet, within those circles, her name carries enormous weight. Nancy Guthrie is a Bible teacher, a best-selling author, and what many describe as one of the most powerful voices in the Christian world. When it comes to the subject of loss, she has written books that have sold hundreds of thousands of copies. She has spoken at some of the most respected conferences and churches across the United States and far beyond. She has sat across from grieving parents, parents who just buried their children, and somehow found words that actually reached them. She built her platform on something deeply personal, something most people would have kept hidden behind closed doors. She built it on grief, specifically on the deaths of her own children. That sentence alone should stop you, because it is not a metaphor. It is not a clever book title. It is the literal, devastating foundation of everything Nancy Guthrie became publicly known for. In 1999, Nancy and her husband David Guthrie welcomed a daughter named Hope. Hope was born with a rare metabolic condition called Zellweger syndrome, a condition with no cure, no treatment, and a life expectancy measured not in years but in months. Hope lived 199 days, and then she was gone. The world watched, or at least, the Christian world watched, as Nancy processed that loss publicly. She wrote about it. She spoke about it. She let people inside the most private, sacred, and devastating room of her life. And then, in 2001, Nancy and David had another child, a son named Gabriel. Gabriel was also born with Zellweger syndrome. He lived 183 days. To children, same condition, both gone before their first birthdays. The statistical probability alone is staggering. The emotional weight is nearly incomprehensible. Most people would have disappeared into silence after something like that. Most people would have had every right to. But Nancy kept going. She kept writing. She kept teaching. She kept standing on stages, looking into the eyes of broken people, and telling them that God is good, that grief has purpose, that suffering, no matter how deep, can be survived. To many, she became an icon of faith under fire, a living testimony that the human spirit, anchored in belief, could withstand almost anything. But something has shifted recently, something quiet and significant. New questions are being asked, new details are being examined, and the latest evidence suggests that the story of Nancy Guthrie may be far more layered, far more complicated, and far more emotionally explosive than the polished narrative most people have simply accepted. Before the books, before the stages, before the grief. There was just Nancy. Growing up in a modest American home, Nancy Guthrie was, by most accounts, a woman shaped by faith from an early age. She didn't come from wealth or fame or privilege. She came from the ordinary world, the world of Sunday mornings and family dinners and learning, slowly and sometimes painfully, what it means to believe in something you cannot see or touch or prove. She pursued a life in Christian ministry and communication, eventually finding her voice in writing and public speaking. She married David Guthrie, a man who shared her faith and her quiet commitment to building a life rooted in something deeper. than comfort or achievement. They were, by all appearances, a family with a strong foundation. Two people who had chosen each other and chosen a life of purpose together. But life has a way of testing even the strongest foundations. Few people fully understand how isolating it is to carry the knowledge that your own genetics, your very biology, might be dangerous to the children you desperately want to have. When Hope was born and diagnosed with Zellweger syndrome, Nancy and David were told clearly that the condition was genetic. The probability of having another affected child was not small. It was significant. It was real. It was a number that would follow them into every quiet conversation they ever had about the future. And yet they chose to have Gabriel. That choice, that single, profound, and yes, controversial decision, is one that Nancy has spoken about openly over the years. She has framed it always in the language of faith, of trust, of surrender to something larger than fear. She has said that she and David felt called to welcome life regardless of what that life might cost them, but not everyone has understood that choice. Not everyone has been able to hold it without asking harder questions. And is that choice revisited now in light of new conversations happening in grief communities and theological circles? That forms one of the sharpest and most uncomfortable edges of the mystery that now surrounds her story. Grief, when it is raw and honest, has a strange magnetism. People don't always understand why, but there is something deeply primal about watching another human being walk through fire and refuse to be destroyed. It gives the rest of us permission to believe we might survive our own fires too. That is what Nancy Guthrie gave people after Hope died. Nancy co-wrote a book with David called Holding On to Hope. It became a landmark in Christian grief literature almost immediately. It didn't read like a theology textbook. It didn't read like a polished ministry resource. It read like a diary, like a wound that had been carefully, courageously opened on the page and offered to strangers who were bleeding the same way. People wept reading it. They pressed it into the hands of friends who had just lost children. They left copies in hospital waiting rooms and passed them to pastors who didn't know what else to say. And Nancy's voice, calm, measured, soaked simultaneously in sorrow and conviction, became a sound that the grieving world sought out and returned to. She followed that book with more. The one-year Book of Hope, the Seeing Jesus series, a grief retreat ministry called Respite Retreat that she and David built specifically for parents who had lost children, a physical space, a dedicated time, a community of the shattered coming together so that no one had to be alone in the most isolating experience a human being can endure. She didn't just write about grief. She built infrastructure around it. She created architecture and community inside the most desolate place most people will ever visit. Invitations to speak multiplied. Conferences, mega churches, universities, international stages. Nancy Guthrie became, in the truest and most extraordinary sense, a figure built entirely out of pain transformed into purpose. But what was quietly unfolding beneath the surface of all that visible success? What was happening in the spaces between the stages and the book signings and the retreat weekends changed the texture of this story in ways most audiences never fully grasped. Here is where the story gets complicated. And it is important, deeply important, to say this clearly before going any further. There's no scandal in the tabloid sense attached to Nancy Guthrie. No arrest, no public collapse, no dramatic unraveling caught on camera. But there is something that may be more unsettling than scandal. There is the question of narrative. When a person builds their entire public identity on tragedy, and when that tragedy is as extreme and as visible as burying two children, the world tends to extend a kind of sacred immunity. People don't ask hard questions. It feels almost cruel, almost indecent, to push back against someone who has already suffered so much. And that immunity, that unspoken collective agreement not to look too closely, may have allowed certain real complexities in Nancy's story to go unexamined for a very long time. The questions now surfacing in various online communities among theologians, grief counselors, and longtime followers who love her work are not questions of character. They are not attacks. They are questions of completeness. Did the public version of Nancy's story ever fully capture the private cost of what she carried? Were there cracks in that composed exterior that never made it into any of the books? Were there seasons of doubt, rage, and collapse, the genuinely messy, unglamorous, ugly territory of grief that were quietly edited out in favor of a cleaner, more redemptive arc? Some who have worked alongside Nancy in ministry settings have gently suggested, always with care, always with deep respect, that the version of grief she presented publicly was, at times, almost too composed, too resolved, too beautifully framed for what she had actually lived through behind closed doors. And that gap, the space between the private reality and the public testimony, is exactly the kind of gap where the most explosive and most necessary questions are born. Behind the author, behind the speaker, behind the theology and the conference stages and the carefully chosen words, there is a mother who buried her daughter and then buried her son. No amount of faith makes that clean. No amount of public purpose erases those private midnights, the moments that will never make it into any book, the silences between David and Nancy that no audience ever witnessed, the particular, unrepeatable, devastating agony of holding a child who is already leaving before they have had any real chance to arrive. Nancy has spoken, in fragments and carefully chosen moments, about these darker corners of her experience. She has admitted to anger. She has admitted to the terrifying sensation of a faith being stretched to its absolute outermost edge. She has said, across various interviews over the years, that she is not a poster child for grief done perfectly or gracefully. She is simply someone who kept showing up day after day, even when showing up was the hardest thing imaginable. People close to her world describe a woman of extraordinary internal discipline, a woman who understood, perhaps earlier than most, that the world needed her to be strong, and who, at what may have been considerable personal cost, learned to be strong. But that raises the question that haunts the edges of her entire story. Who held Nancy? Who sat with her in the rooms she never described publicly? Who witnessed the version of her grief that had no theological framework built around it? No redemptive arc attached, no audience waiting for the resolution? That question, quiet, persistent, profoundly human, is more than curiosity. It is the emotional core of the mystery that now surrounds everything Nancy Guthrie has built, and everything she has become. Time does something to all of us that it softens certain edges. It sharpens others. It reveals things that urgency and survival instinct had kept carefully hidden. For Nancy Guthrie, the passage of years since Hope and Gabriel's deaths has brought something that grief literature almost never captures with full honesty: the strange, disorienting experience of continuing, the odd mixture of guilt and grace that comes from still being here, from having a life that kept accumulating new experiences, friendships, travels, small victories, ordinary unremarkable Tuesdays, while 2 children remained forever still at 199 days and 183 days. In recent years, those who follow Nancy's work closely have noticed a shift in her. Her language has grown deeper and more worn. Her willingness to sit inside ambiguity, to resist rushing toward resolution, has visibly grown. She speaks now with a kind of tired, genuine honesty that feels meaningfully different from the urgent, mission-driven testimony of her earlier years. She seems, in the most real sense, like a woman who has been doing the long, slow, unglamorous, and largely invisible work of actually surviving something. Not performing survival, not narrating it for an audience, but living it quietly, in all the ordinary days that pile up into a life. And it is in this more recent version of Nancy, more complicated, more textured, more willing to sit in the unresolved, that the latest evidence raises its most powerful and most important challenge to everything we thought the story was. So what is the explosive new evidence? What is the thing that actually changes everything? Here is the truth, and it is a truth that turns out to be more profound, more human, and more lasting than any conventional scandal could ever be. The latest evidence is not a document. It is not a leaked recording or a hidden accusation or a secret that someone finally decided to tell. The latest evidence is a growing and increasingly vocal body of testimony from grieving families, real people who attended Nancy's respite retreats, read her books, absorbed her teaching, and then found themselves, quietly and privately, in a place they had not expected to be, more alone than when they started. These were people who came to Nancy's work desperate, truly desperate, for permission to be completely devastated, for someone to tell them that their grief did not need to be neat, did not need to resolve, did not need to point anywhere at all except toward the raw, unmediated truth of what they had lost. And what they found instead, for all its genuine beauty and real craft, was something that still pointed, always and inevitably, toward resolution, toward meaning, toward the destination of God's goodness waiting at the end of the tunnel. Whether or not the tunnel ever actually ended for them, for some of those families, the ones whose faith had already been fractured and not repaired by loss, that destination felt not comforting but unreachable, not like a lighthouse but like a judgment, a quiet, unspoken suggestion that if they hadn't found meaning yet, perhaps they simply weren't grieving correctly. The explosive question sitting at the center of all of this is one that nobody in Nancy's world has been willing to ask out loud until now. When a grief ministry is built on one person's very particular story of suffering and survival, what happens to the people whose grief doesn't resolve the same way? What happens to the parents who bury a child and never find meaning, who reach for faith and find their hands completely empty, who watch Nancy Guthrie standing composed and purposeful on a stage and feel, in the absolute depth of their own ongoing chaos, not comforted but more alone than they were before they came? This is the hidden tension living at the very heart of Nancy Guthrie's legacy. Not malice, not deception, not a single deliberate act of harm. But the very real, very human, and ultimately unavoidable limitation of holding up one person's survival, one particular path through, one particular darkness, as a navigable map for every other person's grief. And in that gap, the space between the map and the actual territory of individual, irreducible, 7 billion different versions of human loss. The most important questions about Nancy Guthrie's story are finally, carefully, and necessarily being spoken out loud. That Nancy Guthrie is not a villain in this story. She is not even a cautionary tale. She is something far more complicated, and ultimately far more interesting, than either of those things could ever be. She is a human being who was handed an unbearable weight and chose, deliberately, courageously, imperfectly, to carry it in public, who decided that her pain had something to offer the world, who built something real and lasting and genuinely helpful to thousands upon thousands of people out of the absolute wreckage of her most private sorrow. And like every single person who has ever done that, like every person who has ever turned a wound into work, who has ever tried to build something meaningful out of something devastating, she inevitably reached the limits of what one story can hold. Because grief is not one story. It never was. Grief is 7 billion stories, each one unrepeatable, each one sovereign, each one deserving of a witness, patient and humble enough to not rush it toward any predetermined destination. The mystery of Nancy Guthrie is ultimately the mystery of all of us who have ever lost something and tried, desperately, humanly, imperfectly, to make some kind of sense of it. We reach for meaning because the alternative is almost too vast to stand inside. The possibility that some loss is just loss, that some pain points nowhere, that some children die, and the universe simply does not explain itself afterward. Nancy Guthrie looked directly into that vastness and chose faith. Others look into the exact same vastness and find only silence. Neither answer is wrong. Both are real. Both are human. Both deserve space and patience, and the kind of witness that does not flinch or rush or redirect. And maybe that is the most important thing the latest evidence in this story finally reveals. Not specifically about Nancy Guthrie, but about every single one of us who grieves, who wonders, who keeps asking questions that the world may never fully answer. We are all, in our own way, trying to hold on to hope, even when hope is also a name on a gravestone. Even then,